You know, I believe in holding politicians on both sides to account. That's fair enough, and that's what opposition should do too, hold politicians to account, and character also does matter. That's part of the whole deal. And I have to say that Scott Morrison last December, made a big mistake, a political mistake. After a huge year of politics, he kept his promise to his daughters, went on holidays to Hawaii with his family. But that was just as our bushfires turned deadly. It was a terrible look, terrible look. Now, it's true, the federal government is actually not in charge of fighting fires. If he'd been back here, I'm not sure what more he could have done that the Deputy Prime Minister couldn't do in his place. But being on holidays looked awful. Now, for that mistake, he has spent the last month and a half admitting it was indeed a mistake and of saying sorry as recently as this week. And yet Labor today could not let this go. It launched the most full-on, vicious attack on that and other alleged sins Morrison committed with the fires.
Does the Prime Minister regret saying that volunteer firefighters don't need economic compensation for lost income because they, quote, want to be out there?
Does the Prime Minister regret saying he had a conversation with a bushfire survivor who lost her home in Cobargo when video clearly shows there wasn't a conversation? He forced her to shake his hand and then turned his back on her as she asked for help.
Does the Prime Minister regret telling communities devastated by the bushfires that the economic impact, quote, could well prove to be positive?
Does the Prime Minister regret saying, and I quote, "I don't hold a hose, mate," when Australians were looking to him for national leadership?
You know, I'm not an expert in this, but just I jotted this down, I was hearing that. The compensation for not, he said, they accused him of saying volunteer firefighters shouldn't have compensation for their time. He didn't say that. I checked the transcript. A woman turned her back on him, yeah, and, I mean, you know, really? And that the economic blow could actually be positive. That's out of context because of all the aid that there was hopefully going to come. It was a bad comment, but let's put it in context. And as for the hose, that's because someone virtually accused him of not standing there fighting fires instead of being on holidays. He said, well, Prime Ministers don't actually hold the fires. Well, and that's actually true of every Prime Minister except one, Tony Abbott. Joining me a short while ago to discuss all this and other developments in Canberra was Kieran Gilbert, Sky News Chief News Anchor. Kieran Gilbert, thank you so much for joining me. That was one huge attack on Scott Morrison's character. Now, in my opinion, some of the things that Labor said he had said, well, they misrepresented him, but there's no doubt that Scott Morrison, during the fires, looked very rattled by the criticisms of him having been on holidays at the start. But what exactly do you think was gained by Labor savaging him about all that now?
Yeah, it's interesting, Andrew, because I agree with you that during the fire season, during the summer, Mr Morrison did lose some confidence there. And like any human being, when we make a mistake or two, they tend to feed off each other. And I think that those around him felt that that is where it was at. At the moment, though, he's definitely... He's got more of his confidence back, and there were moments in the question time today where I thought he gave the perfect response, some humility on show where he said, look, I'm human, I made a mistake and I've admitted to it previously outside of the parliament. And that sort of response, I think, is very, very effective for him, as it was for Peter Beattie all those years as Queensland Premier. He was the master apologiser. As for why Labor's doing it now, this is the first time in the Parliament that they've had the chance to raise these issues to Scott Morrison directly. And I guess they feel that it's something that's resonated in the electorate and they're trying to capitalise on it politically. Whether or not they can, whether or not the ship sailed, so to speak, on it, that's another question entirely.
I agree with you completely on the power of apologies. Other news, political news today, Kieran. The Morrison government has lost 2 ministers in the last week or so. Bridget McKenzie quit as Agriculture Minister over her astonishing sports fraud scandal before the election. And the talented Matt Canavan quit as Resources Minister to support Barnaby Joyce in his since failed bid to become the new Nationals leader. Well, today their replacements were announced as Darren Chester, the Veteran Affairs Minister. He goes to Cabinet. Keith Pitt comes in as the new Resources Minister, and then you've got Kevin Hogan promoted to Minister assisting the Deputy Prime Minister. Do those changes also change the sort of complexion or the direction or the ideology or the balance of the government at all? What signals do they send to you?
Oh, well, I think one major signal it sends to me, and this was raised a number of times today with those in the Joyce camp, that this has done nothing to create peace in that small party room of 21, because all those that have been promoted are those that voted for Michael McCormack. There was no olive branch extended to anyone who voted for Barnaby Joyce, and that, as I say, that point was made to me repeatedly today. So I think the first point to make is that this is not over, that Barnaby Joyce will continue to push for that job back. And there was also a push back against any suggestion of a rule change. Yesterday, Michael McCormack told us on Sky News that he wanted a change to stop this sort of spill from happening. Well, that's not going to happen, because those around Barnaby Joyce, but others as well, that voted for Michael McCormack want the option to replace him if need be. As far as the approach on energy and so on goes, look, maybe a slight shift, but Matt Canavan, a very strong supporter of the coal industry, and I believe, whether you agree with him or not, he is their best performer. He was very potent, Andrew, in the election campaign in Queensland, in Central and North Queensland. He's a very smart individual, and as I say, whether you agree with his views or not, he's a very capable politician, and a loss to the Morrison cabinet, the fact that he's now on the backbench.
Oh, look, Kieran, I think you've nailed it. And honestly, it says to me that when the Nationals leader, Michael McCormack, when he leaves out Matt Canavan, his most talented performer, and then puts instead three people who like him, who supported him, then obviously is looking to his personal interest above the national interest. We should have the most talented ministers helping Australia get out of this hole. But speaking of Keith Pitt, the new Resources Minister, that was Matt Canavan's old job. I don't write him off, though, I've got to say. He quit early on during the Turnbull government as a minister because he was against its plans to slash our emissions, and is also a big fan of nuclear power, which is actually greenhouse friendly. What difference might he make to the government?
Yeah, well, indeed, and he could, well, remains to be seen how strong a voice he is in the cabinet. But I think more broadly what we're seeing, Andrew, is a National Party emboldened, and whether they're in the cabinet or not, one that will continue to try and push the government to protect coal jobs, the coal industry. As for nuclear power, yeah, Keith Pitt is a very interesting thinker when it comes to energy. He's a former engineer in that space as well. So he's someone with very strong opinions on that in that regard, but I don't see the government making any compromise on nuclear. He is, though, from Queensland. He's another strong voice in that sense, but I don't think, I could be proven wrong, but I don't think he will be of the calibre of Matt Canavan, who has been a very, very successful politician. I don't even think he's 40 years of age yet, but very effective communicator. And as I say, whether you agree with his prescription for energy policy or not, he is a potent political figure, and I think that someone we will see return to the cabinet at some point.
Well, we would hope so, instead of the talk that Bridget McKenzie of Sports for All's fame is ahead of that queue, believe it or not. But here's what, you know, depresses me a little bit about politics here, Kieran. Scott Morrison immediately said no to nuclear, which happens to be safe, clean in terms of global warming emissions, and of course delivers the baseload power that this country is very fast running short of. I mean, he said, oh look, there first has to be bipartisanship, which of course Labor won't give, which effectively means, you know, there's going to be no progress on this at all. Why would he have just ducked this particular fight? It's a fight I think Australia needs to have. Yeah, it's a good question, and you know, someone who is was of a similar view to you over many years is the late Bob Hawke. He argued very strongly for Australia to look at nuclear, that our makeup in terms of the geology of this country is very stable, that we've got vast amounts of areas with which we can store
nuclear material as well, and that we are basically set up with all of our uranium reserves too for that sort of industry. So Bob Hawke, as we know, a hero of not just Labor but Australian modern politics, was of a very, very firm view of that too, in terms of where we should go. But sadly, I agree with you. I think it's something that our leaders should at least be open-minded to, as to the prospects for that, whether or not it makes economic sense. At least let the market make a judgment on that.
Well, I also think, Kieran, that it gives the government would give the government a sense of direction, of purpose. You don't have to win it. You know, you don't have to win the debate, but if you keep pushing it, it gives you, you know, we're here, we're not just minding the shop or keeping the seats warm, you know. And that, I think, the lack of direction is what the government's in part suffering from. Kieran, Gilbert, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.